I'm sitting here in my prayer room at 4 a.m., staring at an open Bible with tears streaming down my face, and I honestly can't stop shaking from what God just revealed to me about the rapture's secret signal that most believers have completely missed. The silence in this room feels pregnant with divine anticipation, like the very air is holding its breath for the moment when heaven's trumpet sounds and everything changes forever. I thought I understood the signs of Christ's return after years of studying prophecy and portraying Jesus in film. But what he showed me about the hidden signal that will precede the rapture, it's been right there in Scripture all along, yet virtually every believer I know has overlooked its profound significance. The flickering candle on my desk seems almost prophetic now, like it's representing the final moments of this age before the light of Christ's return illuminates everything. And honestly, that's exactly what God wanted me to understand, that there is a specific, unmistakable signal that will occur immediately before the rapture, but it's not what most Christians are watching for, and missing it could leave even sincere believers unprepared for the most important moment in human history. Wherever you're watching this right now, whether you're a prophecy student who thinks you know all the signs, a casual believer who assumes the rapture will just happen without warning, or someone who's skeptical about end times events, this message will either revolutionize your understanding of biblical prophecy or challenge everything you thought you knew about Christ's return for his church. But here's what I need you to understand before I share what I witnessed. This isn't about date setting or creating fear. This is about a specific biblical signal that God himself revealed as the final indicator before the rapture occurs. And honestly, after seeing what I've seen, I realize that this signal is not only scriptural and imminent, but it's already beginning to manifest in ways that most believers aren't recognizing. It started 4 months ago when I was preparing for a scene where Jesus speaks about the signs of his coming. As I was studying the various rapture passages, Matthew 24, Luke 21, 1 Thessalonians 4, Revelation 3 asks, I found myself genuinely troubled by what seemed like contradictory information about whether the rapture would come with signs or without warning. That night, I couldn't shake Jesus' words about watching and being ready, combined with Paul's description of the rapture coming like a thief in the night. How can believers watch for something that comes without warning? How can we be ready for signs if there are no signs to watch for? But you know what really stirred my heart? Over the next few weeks, I started receiving messages from Christians all over the world who were struggling with similar questions about the timing and signals of the rapture. Michael wrote, I've been studying prophecy for 30 years, but I'm confused about whether we should be watching for signs or expecting the rapture to come without warning. What exactly are we supposed to be watching for? Rebecca confessed, I hear teachers say the rapture is imminent and could happen any second, but then they talk about signs we should watch for. If it's truly imminent, why watch for signs? If there are signs, how is it imminent? David shared, I've been watching for all the traditional signs, wars, earthquakes, false prophets, but I feel like I'm missing something. Is there a specific signal that will tell us the rapture is about to happen? Sarah asked. Jesus said to watch, but watch for what exactly? I don't want to be caught off guard, but I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for that's different from what's always been happening. Honestly, these messages revealed something that shocked me. Here were sincere believers who wanted to be watching and ready, but they were confused about what they were supposed to be watching for. They understood that Christ could return at any moment, but they also sensed there should be some kind of signal or indicator that would help them recognize when his return was imminent. You know what struck me about every single message? These Christians weren't asking whether the rapture would happen, they believed it would. They weren't asking when it would happen, they knew it could be soon. They were asking what they should be watching for that would signal its immediate approach, and that question was creating confusion that no one seemed equipped to address clearly. And that's when I realized something bigger was happening here. God wasn't just stirring my heart to understand the rapture. He was preparing to reveal something about the secret signal that would help believers recognize when his return was truly imminent. It was 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night, when I finally worked up the courage to ask God directly about the rapture's secret signal. I had been carrying these questions for months, honestly uncertain about what his answer might reveal about the timing of Christ's return. I was here in this very prayer room at midnight, surrounded by the same silence and candlelight, when I fell on my face before God and cried out with desperation I'd never felt before about this topic. God, I prayed, I need to understand the truth about the rapture's signal. Your word says to watch, but what exactly should we be watching for? Is there a specific sign that will indicate the rapture is about to occur? Show me the secret signal that believers need to recognize. You know what happened next? The presence of God filled this room with such overwhelming glory and anticipation that I began weeping before he even spoke. But this wasn't just his comforting presence. This was the presence of the one who holds the timing of all prophetic events, who knows the exact moment when the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will rise. "Jonathan," came a voice that carried both infinite patience and urgent warning, "you have asked me about the rapture's secret signal, and I will show you the truth that has been hidden in plain sight throughout Scripture. But prepare yourself. What you are about to learn will challenge popular assumptions while revealing the biblical indicator that my people must recognize." Honestly, I thought I was prepared for his answer. But you know what? Nobody is prepared for what God is about to reveal about the rapture's secret signal. "Look," God commanded, "and I will show you the signal that will immediately precede the rapture. A signal that is both scriptural and imminent, both hidden and obvious, both spiritual and observable." Suddenly, it was as if I was transported into the spiritual realm to witness the cosmic preparations for the rapture, seeing both the heavenly and earthly indicators that will signal the most significant event since Christ's resurrection. I found myself observing the spiritual atmosphere around the earth in the moments leading up to the rapture, and what I saw was unlike anything I had ever imagined. "The first thing you must understand," God explained, "is that the rapture will not occur without a signal, but the signal is not what most believers are watching for." I watched as God showed me Christians around the world who were watching for traditional signs, wars, earthquakes, famines, false prophets, while missing the actual signal that would indicate the rapture's immediate approach. "Look at what most believers are watching for," God instructed. I saw prophecy students tracking global conflicts, monitoring natural disasters, cataloging false teachings, and analyzing political developments, believing these were the signs that would signal the rapture's nearness. But when I looked at these signs from heaven's perspective, I saw something surprising. "These signs," God explained, "indicate the general season of my return, but they are not the specific signal of the rapture. They have been present throughout church history and will continue until the end of the tribulation. They create awareness of prophetic times, but they do not signal the rapture's immediate approach." I watched as believers who were focused on these traditional signs remained uncertain about the timing of the rapture because these signs had been present for decades without the rapture occurring. "The secret signal," God continued, "is not about external circumstances but about spiritual conditions. It is not about world events but about church conditions. It is not about what is happening in the world but about what is happening in my people." But then God showed me the actual signal that will precede the rapture. "Look at the true signal of the rapture's approach," God instructed. I watched as God revealed a spiritual phenomenon that was both invisible to natural eyes but observable to spiritual eyes, both hidden from the world but obvious to those who were watching spiritually. "The secret signal of the rapture," God explained, "is the completion of the bride, the moment when the last person who will be saved before the rapture receives Christ and is added to the church." I saw that in heaven, there is a specific number of people who will comprise the church, the bride of Christ, and when that number is complete, the rapture will occur immediately. "Look at how this works," God instructed. I watched as souls around the world were being saved and added to the church, and I could see that each salvation was being recorded in heaven as part of the completion of the bride. "The church," God explained, "is not just a spiritual organization, but a specific number of people chosen before the foundation of the world to be the bride of Christ. When the last person in that number is saved, the bride is complete, and the rapture will occur." I saw that this completion was not arbitrary, but was based on God's perfect foreknowledge of who would respond to the gospel and become part of the church. "This is why the rapture's timing cannot be calculated by human wisdom," God continued, "because it depends not on external events, but on the completion of an internal spiritual reality, the fullness of the bride." But then God showed me how this signal manifests in observable ways. "Look at the signs that indicate the bride's completion is near," God instructed. I watched as God revealed specific spiritual indicators that would become visible as the completion of the bride approached. "The first indicator," God explained, "is an unprecedented acceleration of global evangelism, a final harvest of souls that will complete the bride before the rapture." I saw that in the final period before the rapture, there would be an explosion of gospel preaching, soul winning, and conversions around the world as God gathered the final members of his bride. "Look at this final harvest," God instructed. I watched as believers around the world were suddenly filled with unprecedented urgency and power for evangelism, leading to massive numbers of conversions in a short period of time. This harvest, God explained, is not just normal evangelism but supernatural soul winning that will gather the final members of the bride. When this harvest is complete, the rapture will occur immediately. I saw that this harvest would be characterized by unusual boldness in believers, supernatural power in gospel preaching, and extraordinary responsiveness in unbelievers. The second indicator, God continued, is a supernatural unity among true believers, a spiritual bonding of the bride that will occur as her completion approaches. I watched as genuine Christians around the world began experiencing unprecedented unity, love, and spiritual connection with other believers, regardless of denominational differences. Look at this unity of the bride, God instructed. I saw believers who had been divided by secondary issues suddenly finding themselves drawn together by their common love for Christ and their shared anticipation of His return. This unity, God explained, is not organizational but spiritual, a supernatural bonding of the bride that occurs as she prepares to meet her bridegroom. It is a sign that the wedding is near. I watched as this unity produced increased prayer, worship, and fellowship among believers who recognized their spiritual connection as members of Christ's bride. The third indicator, God revealed, is an intensification of spiritual warfare, a final assault by Satan against the bride as he realizes his time is short. I watched as demonic forces launched unprecedented attacks against believers, trying to prevent the completion of the bride and delay the rapture. Look at this final spiritual battle, God instructed. I saw that as the bride's completion approached, believers would face increased temptation, persecution, and spiritual opposition designed to cause them to fall away or become ineffective. This warfare, God explained, is Satan's desperate attempt to prevent the bride's completion, but it actually serves as a sign that the rapture is near because it indicates that Satan knows his time is short. I watched as believers who understood this warfare were able to stand firm and even use the opposition as confirmation that Christ's return was imminent. The fourth indicator, God continued, is a supernatural preparation of the bride, a final sanctification and readiness that will occur immediately before the rapture. I watched as true believers around the world began experiencing unprecedented conviction about sin, hunger for holiness, and desire for intimacy with Christ. Look at this preparation of the bride, God instructed. I saw Christians who had been lukewarm suddenly becoming passionate for Christ, believers who had been compromised suddenly pursuing holiness, and church members who had been nominal suddenly becoming genuine disciples. This preparation, God explained, is my Spirit's final work in the bride to make her ready for the wedding. It is a sign that the rapture is imminent because the bride must be prepared before she can be taken. I watched as this preparation produced increased prayer, worship, Bible study, and holy living among believers who sensed that something significant was about to happen. But the fifth indicator was the most specific and observable. The final indicator, God revealed, is a supernatural revelation to the bride about the nearness of the rapture, a spiritual knowing that will come upon true believers immediately before it occurs. I watched as genuine Christians around the world began receiving supernatural awareness that the rapture was about to happen, not through human calculation but through divine revelation. Look at this final revelation, God instructed. I saw believers who had been uncertain about the timing of the rapture suddenly receiving clear spiritual understanding that Christ's return was imminent, not in years or months, but in days or hours. This revelation, God explained, is my gift to the watching bride, a supernatural awareness that will prepare her heart for the moment of translation. It is the secret signal that only true believers will recognize. I watched as believers who received this revelation began making final preparations, sharing urgent warnings with others, and living with intense anticipation of Christ's return. These 5 indicators together, God said, constitute the secret signal of the rapture, the completion of the bride manifested through accelerated evangelism, supernatural unity, intensified warfare, spiritual preparation, and divine revelation. But then God revealed the most shocking truth about this secret signal. This signal is not future but present. It is already beginning to manifest, and the completion of the bride is nearer than most believers realize. God said with urgency that made the very foundations of heaven tremble. I watched as God showed me these indicators already beginning to appear around the world in ways that most Christians weren't recognizing. Look at what is happening right now, God instructed. I saw unprecedented global evangelism occurring through technology, media, and missionary efforts. I saw genuine believers from different denominations finding unity around their love for Christ. I saw increased spiritual warfare against Christians worldwide. I saw believers experiencing new hunger for holiness and intimacy with God. And I saw some believers beginning to receive supernatural awareness that Christ's return was near. The secret signal, God explained, is not a single event but a convergence of spiritual realities that indicate the bride's completion is approaching rapidly. And honestly, what God revealed next about how believers should respond to this secret signal will either prepare you for the most important moment in history or leave you unprepared for the greatest event of all time. The candle flame on my desk seems to flicker with prophetic intensity now, as if it's responding to the weight of what God revealed next about how believers should recognize and respond to the rapture's secret signal that's already manifesting around the world. The silence in this prayer room feels charged with divine urgency, like creation itself is holding its breath as the final preparations for the rapture accelerate beyond what most Christians realize. And honestly, that's exactly what God wanted me to understand, that the secret signal isn't just something to watch for in the future, but something that's actively unfolding right now in ways that will either awaken prepared believers or leave unprepared ones completely caught off guard. Now I will show you exactly how my people can recognize this secret signal and how they should respond when they see it manifesting. God said with an authority that made the very air around me pulse with divine truth. Because, Jonathan, most believers are looking for the wrong signs in the wrong places, and they will miss the actual signal that indicates the rapture is imminent unless they understand what to watch for and how to respond. You know what happened next? God began revealing the specific ways that believers can identify each component of the secret signal and the urgent actions they must take when they recognize these indicators. And honestly, what he showed me was both incredibly practical and desperately urgent. This wasn't about complex prophetic calculations or mysterious spiritual phenomena, but about observable spiritual realities that any sincere believer can recognize if they know what to look for. The first component of the secret signal that my people must recognize, God explained, is the acceleration of global evangelism, but not just any evangelism, but supernatural soul winning that produces unprecedented numbers of conversions in a short period of time. I watched as God showed me believers around the world who were beginning to experience this supernatural evangelistic power. Look at how this accelerated evangelism manifests, God instructed. I saw Christians who had never been bold in sharing their faith, suddenly finding themselves compelled to witness with unusual urgency and power. I saw gospel presentations that normally would be rejected being received with surprising openness. I saw mass conversions occurring in places where the gospel had previously been resisted. This acceleration, God explained, is not human effort but divine intervention, my Spirit moving in unprecedented ways to gather the final members of the bride before the rapture occurs. I watched as believers who recognized this supernatural evangelism understood it as a sign that the rapture was approaching and responded by joining the harvest with increased urgency. When my people see this acceleration, God continued, they must recognize it as part of the secret signal and respond by participating in the final harvest, not as casual witnesses but as urgent soul winners who understand that time is short. But then God showed me believers who were missing this signal entirely. Look at those who don't recognize the evangelistic acceleration, God instructed. I saw Christians who were aware of increased evangelistic activity, but dismissed it as normal church growth or human enthusiasm, failing to recognize the supernatural nature of what was happening. These believers, God explained, will miss the first component of the secret signal because they are not spiritually discerning the difference between human evangelism and divine harvest. I watched as these believers continued with normal Christian activities while missing the urgent opportunity to participate in the final gathering of the bride. Recognition of the evangelistic acceleration, God said, requires spiritual discernment to see that what is happening is not normal but supernatural, not human but divine, not gradual but accelerated. The second component was equally specific and observable. My people must recognize the supernatural unity among true believers, but not organizational unity, but spiritual bonding that transcends denominational differences and creates unprecedented love among the bride, God revealed. I watched as God showed me genuine Christians around the world who were experiencing this supernatural unity. Look at how this unity manifests, God instructed. I saw believers from different denominations, backgrounds, and theological traditions finding themselves drawn together by their common love for Christ and shared anticipation of His return. I saw Christians who had been divided by secondary issues suddenly recognizing their spiritual connection as members of the same bride. This unity, God explained, is not human effort at cooperation but divine preparation of the bride for her wedding, my Spirit bonding my people together as the rapture approaches. I watched as believers who experienced this unity understood it as confirmation that Christ's return was near and responded by deepening their fellowship with other genuine believers. When my people experience this unity, God continued, they must recognize it as part of the secret signal and respond by strengthening their bonds with other true believers, not through organizational merger but through spiritual fellowship. But then God showed me believers who were resisting this unity. Look at those who reject the supernatural unity, God instructed. I saw Christians who were so focused on denominational differences, theological disputes, and organizational loyalties that they rejected fellowship with other genuine believers who didn't match their specific preferences. These believers, God explained, will miss the second component of the secret signal because they are more committed to human divisions than to spiritual unity. I watched as these believers remained isolated in their denominational bubbles while missing the supernatural bonding that was preparing the bride for the rapture. Recognition of supernatural unity, God said, requires humility to see beyond human differences to spiritual realities and willingness to fellowship with all genuine members of the bride. The third component was more challenging to recognize. My people must discern the intensification of spiritual warfare, but not just general opposition, but specific attacks designed to prevent the completion of the bride and delay the rapture, God revealed. I watched as God showed me the spiritual battle that was raging around believers as the rapture approached. Look at how this warfare manifests, God instructed. I saw believers experiencing unprecedented temptation to compromise their faith, unusual persecution for their Christian witness, and specific attacks on their evangelistic efforts and spiritual unity. This warfare, God explained, is Satan's desperate attempt to prevent the bride's completion because he knows that when she is complete, his time on earth is finished. I watched as believers who recognized this warfare understood it as confirmation that the rapture was near and responded by putting on the full armor of God and standing firm against spiritual attacks. When my people face this warfare, God continued, they must recognize it as part of the secret signal and respond not with fear or compromise, but with spiritual warfare that defeats Satan's attempts to delay the rapture. But then God showed me believers who were being defeated by this warfare. Look at those who don't recognize the spiritual battle, God instructed. I saw Christians who were experiencing increased opposition but interpreted it as normal life difficulties rather than spiritual warfare designed to prevent the bride's completion. These believers, God explained, will be defeated by attacks they don't recognize and will become casualties in the final battle rather than victors who help complete the bride. I watched as these believers gave in to temptation, compromised their witness, and withdrew from evangelistic efforts because they didn't understand the spiritual nature of their opposition. Recognition of intensified warfare, God said, requires spiritual discernment to see that increased opposition is not coincidental, but strategic, not random, but targeted at preventing the rapture. The fourth component required personal spiritual sensitivity. My people must recognize the supernatural preparation occurring in their own hearts, but not just general spiritual growth, but specific preparation for the rapture through increased holiness and intimacy with me, God revealed. I watched as God showed me believers who were experiencing this supernatural preparation. Look at how this preparation manifests, God instructed. I saw Christians who had been lukewarm suddenly experiencing intense hunger for God, believers who had been compromised suddenly feeling deep conviction about sin, and church members who had been nominal suddenly developing genuine intimacy with Christ. This preparation, God explained, is my Spirit's final work in the bride to make her ready for the wedding, a supernatural sanctification that occurs as the rapture approaches. I watched as believers who recognized this preparation understood it as evidence that the rapture was near and responded by cooperating with God's sanctifying work in their lives. When my people experience this preparation, God continued, they must recognize it as part of the secret signal and respond by yielding to my sanctifying work, not resisting conviction, but embracing the holiness that prepares them for translation. But then God showed me believers who were resisting this preparation. Look at those who resist supernatural preparation, God instructed. I saw Christians who were experiencing conviction about sin and hunger for holiness, but who dismissed these feelings as religious emotionalism or legalistic pressure. These believers, God explained, will miss the fourth component of the secret signal because they are more comfortable with spiritual mediocrity than with the holiness required for rapture readiness. I watched as these believers quenched the Spirit's convicting work and remained unprepared for the rapture despite God's efforts to sanctify them. Recognition of supernatural preparation, God said, requires sensitivity to my Spirit's convicting work and willingness to pursue the holiness that prepares the bride for her bridegroom. The fifth component was the most supernatural and specific. My people must be open to receiving supernatural revelation about the nearness of the rapture, but not through human calculation or prophetic speculation, but through direct spiritual awareness that I give to the watching bride, God revealed. I watched as God showed me believers who were beginning to receive this supernatural revelation. Look at how this revelation manifests, God instructed. I saw Christians around the world who were suddenly receiving clear spiritual understanding that the rapture was much nearer than they had realized, not through studying prophecy charts, but through direct divine revelation to their spirits. This revelation, God explained, is my gift to the bride who is watching for my return, a supernatural knowing that prepares her heart for the moment of translation. I watched as believers who received this revelation responded with increased urgency in evangelism, deeper preparation of their hearts, and intense anticipation of Christ's return. When my people receive this revelation, God continued, they must recognize it as the final component of the secret signal and respond with immediate preparation and urgent warning to others who may not be ready. But then God showed me believers who were rejecting this revelation. Look at those who dismiss supernatural revelation, God instructed. I saw Christians who were receiving spiritual impressions about the nearness of the rapture, but who dismissed these impressions as wishful thinking or emotional excitement. These believers, God explained, will miss the final component of the secret signal because they trust human reasoning more than spiritual revelation. I watched as these believers ignored the supernatural awareness God was giving them and remained unprepared for the rapture's sudden occurrence. Recognition of supernatural revelation, God said, requires faith to believe that I still speak to my people and willingness to receive spiritual understanding that transcends human knowledge. But then God revealed the most crucial truth about responding to the secret signal. When my people recognize these components of the secret signal occurring together, they must understand that the rapture is not years or months away, but days or hours away, God said with urgency that made the entire spiritual realm lean in to listen. I watched as God showed me believers around the world who were beginning to see multiple components of the secret signal manifesting simultaneously. Look at what happens when the signal components converge, God instructed. I saw Christians who recognized accelerated evangelism, supernatural unity, intensified warfare, spiritual preparation, and divine revelation all occurring at the same time. And they understood that this convergence meant the rapture was imminent. This convergence, God explained, is the complete secret signal. When all five components are present together, the bride's completion is at hand and the rapture will occur very soon. I watched as believers who recognized this convergence responded with immediate and urgent action. Look at how prepared believers respond to the complete signal, God instructed. I saw Christians who recognized the convergence immediately intensifying their evangelistic efforts, deepening their spiritual preparation, strengthening their unity with other believers, engaging in focused spiritual warfare, and living in moment-by-moment expectation of the rapture. This response, God explained, is what I expect from my people when they recognize that the secret signal is complete, not casual acknowledgement, but urgent action. But then God showed me believers who recognized the signal but didn't respond appropriately. Look at those who see the signal but don't respond urgently, God instructed. I saw Christians who intellectually understood that the rapture was near, but who continued living as if they had plenty of time, making long-term earthly plans and maintaining casual attitudes about spiritual things. These believers, God explained, will be caught unprepared even though they recognize the signal, because recognition without response is useless. I watched as these believers were shocked when the rapture occurred because they had seen the signal but hadn't lived in readiness for its fulfillment. Recognizing the secret signal, God said, is only valuable if it produces the urgent response that prepares my people for immediate translation. Then God revealed the most specific instructions for believers who recognize the secret signal. When my people see the secret signal manifesting, God instructed, they must immediately do 5 things. First, they must join the final harvest with unprecedented urgency, understanding that every soul won may be the last one needed to complete the bride. Second, they must strengthen their fellowship with other genuine believers, recognizing that the supernatural unity is preparation for eternal fellowship in heaven. Third, they must engage in focused spiritual warfare, understanding that Satan's attacks are designed to prevent the bride's completion and delay the rapture. Fourth, they must cooperate fully with my sanctifying work in their hearts, pursuing the holiness that prepares them for translation. Fifth, they must live in moment-by-moment expectation of the rapture, making no earthly plans that assume they will be here long-term. But then God revealed what happens when believers properly recognize and respond to the secret signal. Look at the blessing I give to those who recognize and respond to the secret signal, God instructed. I watched believers around the world who had recognized the convergence of the signal components and responded with urgent preparation. Watch what happens to these prepared believers, God said. I saw Christians who lived with supernatural peace because they knew they were ready, divine power because they were cooperating with God's final work, spiritual joy because they were anticipating Christ's return, and eternal perspective because they understood that earthly life was about to end. This is the abundant life I give to those who recognize the secret signal, God explained. Not anxiety about the future, but confidence in their preparation and excitement about their translation. I watched as these believers experienced the rapture with overwhelming joy because they had recognized the signal, responded appropriately, and were completely prepared for Christ's return. When the rapture occurs, God continued, these believers will not be surprised or unprepared. They will be caught up to meet me in the air with celebration because they recognized my secret signal and lived in readiness for this moment. But you know what God's most urgent message was about the secret signal? The secret signal is not just beginning to manifest, it is rapidly approaching completion, and the time for recognition and response is now, not later, God said with intensity that made the very foundations of eternity tremble. And honestly, what God revealed next about how close we actually are to the complete manifestation of this secret signal will either motivate you to immediate action or leave you unprepared for the most important moment in human history. The candle on my desk has burned down to almost nothing now, its final flame dancing with what seems like prophetic urgency, as if it's counting down the final moments before God's secret signal reaches complete manifestation and the rapture occurs. The pre-dawn darkness outside my window feels pregnant with divine anticipation, like creation itself is holding its breath for the moment when heaven's trumpet sounds and everything changes forever. And honestly, that's exactly what God wanted me to understand in these final revelations, Evadia, that the secret signal isn't just something to watch for someday, but something that's actively completing right now in ways that will either awaken prepared believers to immediate action or leave unprepared ones completely shocked when the rapture suddenly occurs. Now I will show you exactly how close the secret signal is to complete manifestation and what every believer must do immediately to be ready for the rapture, God said with an urgency that made the very air around me vibrate with divine warning. Because, Jonathan, the convergence of all 5 signal components is happening faster than most believers realize, and the window of opportunity for final preparation is rapidly closing. You know what happened next? God began revealing the current status of each component of the secret signal and showing me exactly how close we are to the complete convergence that will immediately precede the rapture. And honestly, what he showed me was both incredibly sobering and desperately urgent. I mean, this wasn't about distant future possibilities or theoretical prophetic scenarios, but about present spiritual realities that are accelerating toward completion at a pace that most Christians aren't recognizing. Look at the current status of the evangelistic acceleration, God instructed, and see how close this component is to completion. I watched as God showed me the unprecedented global evangelism that's occurring right now around the world through technology, media, missions, and supernatural soul winning. Observe what is happening in this very moment, God said. I saw the gospel being preached to more people simultaneously than at any time in human history through internet, television, radio, and digital platforms. I saw missionaries reaching previously unreached people groups with supernatural speed and effectiveness. I saw ordinary believers sharing their faith with unusual boldness and seeing extraordinary responses. This acceleration, God explained, is not gradual but exponential. The rate of gospel proclamation and soul winning is increasing at a pace that indicates the final harvest is nearly complete. I watched as conversion rates in certain parts of the world were occurring at levels that defied natural explanation, with entire communities coming to Christ in short periods of time. The evangelistic component of the secret signal, God revealed, is approximately 85% complete. The final members of the bride are being gathered at an accelerating pace that indicates completion is imminent. But then God showed me the supernatural unity component. Look at the current status of the supernatural unity among true believers, God instructed. I watched as genuine Christians around the world were experiencing unprecedented spiritual bonding that transcended denominational, cultural, and geographical boundaries. Observe the unity that is manifesting right now, God said. I saw believers from different backgrounds finding themselves drawn together by their common love for Christ and shared sense that His return was near. I saw Christians who had been divided by secondary issues suddenly recognizing their spiritual connection as members of the same bride. I saw unprecedented cooperation in evangelistic efforts among believers who had previously been separated by organizational differences. This unity, God explained, is not human ecumenism but divine preparation. My spirit bonding the bride together as her wedding approaches. I watched as this supernatural unity was creating new levels of prayer, worship, and fellowship among believers who sensed that something significant was about to happen. The unity component of the secret signal, God revealed, is approximately 75% complete. The spiritual bonding of the bride is accelerating as the rapture approaches. The spiritual warfare component was even more advanced. Look at the current status of the intensified spiritual warfare, God instructed. I watched as demonic forces were launching unprecedented attacks against believers worldwide, with particular focus on disrupting evangelism and unity among Christians. Observe the warfare that is raging right now, God said. I saw believers facing increased persecution for their faith, unusual temptations to compromise their witness, and specific attacks designed to prevent them from participating in the final harvest or experiencing supernatural unity with other Christians. This warfare, God explained, is Satan's desperate final assault, because he knows that when the bride is complete, his time on earth is finished. I watched as the intensity and specificity of these attacks indicated that Satan understood the rapture was much closer than most believers realized. The warfare component of the secret signal, God revealed, is approximately 90% complete. Satan's final assault is reaching its peak intensity because he knows his time is very short. The spiritual preparation component was equally advanced. Look at the current status of the supernatural preparation in believers' hearts, God instructed. I watched as Christians around the world were experiencing unprecedented conviction about sin, hunger for holiness, and desire for intimacy with Christ. Observe the preparation that is occurring right now, God said. I saw believers who had been lukewarm suddenly becoming passionate for God, Christians who had been compromised suddenly pursuing purity, and church members who had been nominal suddenly developing genuine relationship with Christ. This preparation, God explained, is my Spirit's final sanctifying work in the bride to make her ready for translation. I watched as this supernatural preparation was creating new levels of prayer, Bible study, worship, and holy living among believers who sensed they needed to be ready for something important. The preparation component of the secret signal, God revealed, is approximately 80% complete. The bride's sanctification is accelerating as the wedding approaches. But the supernatural revelation component was the most advanced of all. Look at the current status of the supernatural revelation about the rapture's nearness, God instructed. I watched as believers around the world were beginning to receive direct spiritual awareness that the rapture was much closer than they had previously understood. Observe the revelation that is being given right now, God said. I saw Christians who had never focused on prophecy suddenly receiving clear understanding that Christ's return was imminent. I saw believers who had assumed the rapture was years away suddenly sensing it could happen at any moment. I saw ordinary church members receiving supernatural awareness that they needed to prepare immediately for translation. This revelation, God explained, is my gift to the watching bride. Direct spiritual knowledge that prepares her heart for immediate translation. I watched as believers who received this revelation were responding with increased urgency in their spiritual lives and evangelistic efforts. The revelation component of the secret signal, God revealed, is approximately 95% complete. The supernatural awareness of the rapture's nearness is being given to the bride right now. But then God showed me the most shocking truth about the signal's completion. When you combine the current status of all 5 components, God said with intensity that made heaven itself hold its breath, the complete secret signal is approximately 85% manifested, which means the rapture is not years or months away but weeks or days away. I watched as God showed me the convergence of all 5 signal components reaching critical mass simultaneously. Look at what happens when the signal reaches complete manifestation, God instructed. I saw the moment when the final soul was saved and added to the church, completing the predetermined number that comprised the bride of Christ. At that exact moment, the trumpet sounded, the dead in Christ rose, and living believers were caught up to meet Jesus in the air. The rapture, God explained, occurs at the precise moment when the bride is complete, which is indicated by the full manifestation of the secret signal. I watched as this occurred with no additional warning, no further delay, and no opportunity for last-minute preparation. This is why recognition of and response to the secret signal is so urgent, God continued. When it reaches complete manifestation, the rapture occurs immediately. But then God revealed what believers must do right now in response to this revelation. Every believer who hears this message must immediately assess their recognition of and response to the secret signal. God instructed with urgency that made the very foundations of eternity tremble. I watched as God showed me believers around the world who were beginning to recognize the signal components in their own experience and in the world around them. Look at what prepared believers must do immediately, God said. I saw Christians who recognized the accelerated evangelism, joining the final harvest with unprecedented urgency, understanding that every soul won might be the last one needed to complete the bride. Tell my people, God instructed, that they must immediately intensify their evangelistic efforts, not as casual witnesses but as urgent soul winners who understand that the completion of the bride depends on their faithfulness. I watched as believers who understood this urgency began sharing the gospel with everyone they encountered, knowing that any one of these conversations could result in the salvation that completes the bride and triggers the rapture. I saw Christians recognizing the supernatural unity and strengthening their fellowship with other genuine believers, understanding that this bonding was preparation for eternal fellowship in heaven. Tell my people, God continued, that they must immediately deepen their relationships with other true believers, not through organizational activities but through spiritual fellowship that reflects their unity as members of the bride. I watched as believers who understood this unity began gathering for prayer, worship, and mutual encouragement with other Christians who shared their sense of the rapture's nearness. I saw Christians recognizing the intensified warfare and engaging in focused spiritual battle, understanding that Satan's attacks were designed to prevent the bride's completion. Tell my people, God instructed, that they must immediately put on the full armor of God and stand firm against spiritual attacks, not with fear but with authority that defeats Satan's attempts to delay the rapture. I watched as believers who understood this warfare began praying with new intensity, resisting temptation with new determination, and maintaining their witness despite increased opposition. I saw Christians recognizing the supernatural preparation and cooperating fully with God's sanctifying work in their hearts, understanding that holiness was required for translation. Tell my people, God continued, that they must immediately yield to my convicting work and pursue the purity that prepares them for the rapture, not gradually but urgently. I watched as believers who understood this preparation began confessing sin immediately, avoiding compromise completely, and pursuing intimacy with Christ desperately. I saw Christians receiving the supernatural revelation and living in moment-by-moment expectation of the rapture, understanding that it could occur at any time. Tell my people, God instructed, that they must immediately begin living as if the rapture could happen today, making no earthly plans that assume they will be here long-term. I watched as believers who received this revelation began making final preparations, sharing urgent warnings with others, and living with intense anticipation of Christ's return. But then, God revealed the most urgent call to action. Every believer who recognizes the secret signal must immediately become part of the final harvest, the supernatural unity, the spiritual warfare, the holy preparation, and the watching expectation. God said with authority that commanded immediate obedience. I watched believers around the world who responded to this call with immediate and total commitment. Look at what happens to those who respond immediately, God instructed. I saw Christians who dropped everything to join the final harvest, experiencing supernatural power and evangelism that resulted in unprecedented conversions. I saw believers who prioritized spiritual fellowship over earthly activities, experiencing supernatural unity that prepared their hearts for heaven. I saw Christians who engaged in focused spiritual warfare, experiencing supernatural victory over Satan's attacks. This response, God explained, is what I expect from every believer who recognizes that the secret signal is nearly complete and the rapture is imminent. I watched as these responsive believers lived with supernatural peace, power, and purpose because they were cooperating with God's final work before the rapture. But then God showed me believers who recognized the signal but delayed their response. Look at the danger of delayed response, God instructed. I saw Christians who understood that the rapture was near but who postponed urgent action, assuming they still had time to prepare gradually. These believers, God explained with grief, will be caught unprepared even though they recognize the signal, because recognition without immediate response is useless when time is short. I watched as these believers were shocked when the rapture occurred because they had seen the signal but hadn't lived in readiness for its immediate fulfillment. But then God gave me the most specific and urgent instructions for every believer. Tell every person who hears this message, God commanded, that they must immediately do these 5 things. First, examine their own heart to see if they are truly saved and ready for the rapture. Second, join the final harvest by sharing the gospel with everyone they encounter. Third, fellowship urgently with other genuine believers who recognize the signal. Fourth, engage in focused spiritual warfare against Satan's final attacks. Fifth, live in moment-by-moment expectation of the rapture. And tell them, God continued with intensity that made the approaching dawn seem like a symbol of Christ's imminent return, that every day of delayed response is a day of spiritual danger, because the secret signal could reach complete manifestation at any moment. I'm back here in my prayer room now, watching the sun rise over a world that has no idea how close it is to the most significant moment in human history. The dying candle flame seems to represent the final moments of this age before the light of Christ's return changes everything forever. Wherever you are right now, whether you're a longtime believer who thought you understood the signs of Christ's return, a casual Christian who assumed the rapture was still far away, or someone who's never seriously considered the reality of Christ's second coming, you now know the secret signal that indicates the rapture is imminent. The evangelistic acceleration is 85% complete. The supernatural unity is 75% complete. The spiritual warfare is 90% complete. The holy preparation is 80% complete. The divine revelation is 95% complete. The overall secret signal is 85% manifested, which means the rapture could occur at any moment. Are you recognizing these signal components in your own experience and in the world around you? Are you participating in the final harvest with urgent evangelism? Are you experiencing supernatural unity with other genuine believers? Are you engaged in spiritual warfare against Satan's final attacks? Are you cooperating with God's sanctifying work in your heart? Are you receiving supernatural awareness that the rapture is near? If you're not seeing and experiencing these things, you're missing the secret signal that God is giving to prepare His people for the most important moment in history. If you are seeing these things but not responding urgently, you're in danger of being unprepared even though you recognize the signal. The time for casual Christianity is over. The time for gradual preparation is past. The time for delayed response is finished. The secret signal is nearly complete, and the rapture is imminent. Examine your heart right now. Are you truly saved and ready for Christ's return? Join the final harvest immediately. Share the gospel with everyone you encounter. Fellowship urgently with other believers who recognize the signal. Engage in focused spiritual warfare against Satan's attacks. Live in moment-by-moment expectation of the rapture. Jesus, I recognize the secret signal you're giving about the nearness of the rapture. I want to be ready, and I want to help others be ready. Save me if I'm not truly saved. Fill me with urgency for the final harvest. Connect me with other believers who recognize the signal. Give me victory in spiritual warfare. Prepare my heart through holiness. Help me live in constant expectation of your return. Use me in these final moments before the rapture to help complete your bride. In your name, amen. The secret signal is manifesting. The rapture is imminent. The time is now. Your recognition and response in these final moments will determine whether you're prepared or unprepared when the trumpet sounds and the dead in Christ rise. The sun has risen on what could be the final day before the rapture. Are you ready?